I work as a maintenance supervisor for the Diocese of Sacramento. That's important context because it means I had access to places most people don't, and I saw things that made me question everything I thought I understood about the church. This happened in 2019. We were doing renovations on the basement of St. Catherine's, a parish church built in 1947. Nothing unusual, just replacing old pipes, updating electrical. Standard stuff. The head priest, Father Matthias, he was always around during the work. Always. Even when we'd start at 6 a.m., he'd be there in the hallway, just present. One morning, I noticed something off. There was a door in the basement that had been sealed with concrete. Not boarded up. Concrete. Thick, professional work. When I asked about it, the church secretary got quiet. Father Matthias said it was an old storage area they didn't need anymore. That was fine. Not our business. But then my crew started having issues. One guy, Danny, he said the basement made him feel sick. Physically sick. He'd work down there for an hour and have to leave. Another worker, James, he said he kept hearing praying when no one was around. Not hymns. Just repetitive praying in a voice that didn't sound quite right. I didn't believe him at first. Old buildings make noise. Pipes, settling foundation, whatever. But I went down there myself one afternoon to check on the work. And I heard it too. It was coming from behind that concrete wall. The sound was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Someone was praying. The words were Latin, Ave Maria, over and over. But the pacing was wrong. Too fast. Too desperate. Like someone was trying to pray their way out of something. I told the head contractor about it. He said we should contact the church administration. I called my supervisor, who called the diocese office. And here's where it gets strange. Within 3 hours, Father Matthias appeared in the basement with 2 men I'd never seen before. They were wearing dark clothing, no identification, nothing that said who they were. They had a conversation with Father Matthias in hushed tones while I was packing up my equipment. One of them looked at me directly and said, "You didn't hear anything down here?" Not a question. A statement. I nodded. I wasn't trying to be a hero. The next day, Father Matthias asked me to come to his office. He was different. Nervous. He explained that the room behind the wall was part of the church's historical archive. Old records, nothing more. He said sometimes the building settles and creates acoustic effects that sound like voices. He asked if we could redirect our work and avoid that section entirely. I agreed. We did our job differently. But I knew what I'd heard wasn't settling pipes. About 2 weeks later, Danny came to me and said he was quitting. He wouldn't work in that basement anymore. He said the feeling of sickness had followed him home. He was having nightmares. When I asked him what kind of nightmares, he just shook his head and said he couldn't describe them. He looked genuinely frightened. James lasted another week before he also quit. He told me something before he left, though. He said he'd been researching the church's history online, and in the 1950s, there had been a scandal. A priest had been accused of something serious. The records were sealed, but there were old newspaper clippings in the archives. He said the priest's name was Father Marcus Healy, and he died in the church in 1963. The obituary said he died of a heart attack in his private quarters. But James found something else. An old letter in the church's public records. It was from the bishop at the time to Father Matthias's predecessor, discussing the situation with Father Healy and recommending containment and continued prayer rather than external intervention. The work finished in late June. We sealed everything up. The basement looks normal now. Just concrete and pipes. But I drive past St. Catherine's sometimes, and I always notice the same thing. Father Matthias is always in the basement during daylight hours. He goes down there, and you can hear him, faint but audible, praying. The same prayer, over and over. Ave Maria, Ave Maria, Ave Maria, taunt. I've never gone back to check if that sealed room is still there. I met Father Matthias in 2019 at St. Catherine's, a small Catholic church about 40 minutes outside Portland. I wasn't religious. I'd only come that Sunday because my sister insisted. Said she needed family support while she figured some things out. We sat in the back pew. The Mass was ordinary until the homily. Father Matthias was in his 60s, gray-haired, thin. He'd been at St. Catherine's for 18 years, according to the bulletin. But something was off about him that morning. His voice kept cracking. Not emotionally, mechanically, like someone adjusting a microphone. He'd stop mid-sentence, just go silent for 3 or 4 seconds, then continue like nothing happened. My sister didn't notice. Most people didn't seem to. But I watched him the whole service. After Mass, I mentioned it to her. She said I was being weird. 2 weeks later, my sister called me. She'd gone back to the church for confession. She needed to talk to someone about her marriage problems. Father Matthias had been available. She said the confession lasted 40 minutes, which struck her as unusually long. But what really bothered her was that when she left the confessional, she could hear him still praying inside. Not normal prayers, she described it as him repeating the same Latin phrase over and over, getting faster and faster. She asked another parishioner about it later. The woman said Father Matthias had been doing that for months. Staying in the confessional after people left, locked inside, sometimes for hours. The church staff had stopped trying to interrupt him. I called the church office. I told them I was concerned about Father Matthias's well-being, that he seemed unwell. The receptionist, a woman named Carol, got very quiet. She said, "You're not the first person to call." She told me that the diocese already knew. They'd sent someone to evaluate him, but Father Matthias had refused to leave the church. He barricaded himself in the rectory for 3 days. When they finally got in, he wasn't aggressive or anything. He was just praying in every room. The evaluation concluded he was having a mental health crisis, probably a breakdown. They told him to take a leave of absence. He refused. Carol said the bishop had visited personally. Even he couldn't convince Matthias to step down. So they left him there, with the understanding that he'd seek professional help. This was in early 2019. The church put him on limited duties. My curiosity got the better of me. I drove out to St. Catherine's on a weekday afternoon. I wanted to see if he was actually there. The church was open. A few elderly women were doing Stations of the Cross near the front. I walked toward the rectory. A young priest I didn't recognize, Father Tom, according to his nameplate, was in the office doing paperwork. I asked about Father Matthias in a casual way, said I'd noticed he seemed stressed at his last sermon. Father Tom's expression changed immediately. He said Matthias wasn't available for visitors. I asked if he was okay. Father Tom didn't answer directly. He just said, "He's praying. He's always praying now." The way he said it, it wasn't said with concern or sadness. It was said like someone describing a fixed fact. Like how you'd say the sun rises in the east. Fatalistic. I left. But I kept thinking about it. 2 months went by. I didn't go back. Then one evening I got a call from my sister. She'd gone to church that Sunday for Mass. Father Matthias had been there. He looked worse. Gaunt, dark circles under his eyes. But he'd said the full Mass without incident. Except at the very end, during the final blessing, he'd continued blessing people long after the service ended. People were leaving, confused, but he kept his hand raised, kept moving his lips, kept blessing the empty church. Someone finally asked Father Tom to stop him. Father Tom said Father Matthias had been standing there at the altar for another 15 minutes after that, hands still raised, still moving his lips silently. I called the church again. I asked Carol directly, was he still there? She said yes. I asked if anyone had actually gotten him psychiatric help. She didn't answer. I asked if the diocese was going to do anything. She said she didn't know, that it was above her pay grade. Here's where it gets worse. About 6 weeks after that phone call, I saw a news article from the local paper. Short piece, barely a paragraph. A parishioner at St. Catherine's had called 911 because they found Father Matthias in the church at 4 in the morning, alone. They said when the police arrived he was in the sanctuary, on his knees, and he wouldn't stop praying. Not wouldn't stop. Couldn't stop. His lips were moving continuously. When they tried to get him to come with them, his voice didn't even change pace. He just kept praying. The article said he'd been taken for a psychiatric evaluation. That was the last public mention of it. I tried calling the church. Carol no longer worked there. A new receptionist said she had no information about Father Matthias. I called the diocese directly. I got transferred 3 times and eventually reached a Monsignor who simply told me that the situation was being handled and that no further comment would be made. I did something I'm not proud of. I looked up Father Matthias's home address using a reverse phone directory. I drove out there. It was a small house about 5 miles from the church. Neat, ordinary. There was a car in the driveway. Lights on inside. I didn't go to the door. I just sat in my car for 10 minutes, feeling like I was doing something wrong, and then I left. But I couldn't leave it alone. I kept searching online. There was nothing about Father Matthias in the news. Nothing on the diocesan website. It was like after that one article, he'd completely disappeared from any public record. 3 months later, my sister texted me. She'd gone back to St. Catherine's. Father Matthias was saying Mass again. Full schedule. She said he looked healthy, rested even. Said he seemed normal. But she also said that halfway through his sermon, he'd suddenly paused, gone completely silent, and stared at the back wall for about 30 seconds before continuing like nothing happened. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he got help, if something else entirely was going on, or if he's still there at that church, saying Mass every Sunday, pausing at strange moments, eyes distant. But I do know that I've never heard of a recovery like that. Mental health crises don't just resolve. And the way the church handled it, the silence, the stonewalling, that wasn't the response of an institution dealing with a standard mental health situation. Sometimes I think about going back, sitting in that back pew again, watching him during the service. But I don't. And I don't think I want to know the answer.
Always between 3 and 4 a.m. For 6 weeks. She'd had the house inspected. No animals. No structural damage. Then came the knocking on interior walls. Always 3 knocks, she said. Always in sequence, like someone was testing the integrity of the plaster. But here's what bothered me. Sarah's daughter never came downstairs. Not once. Father Dominic didn't ask about her. I remember thinking that was odd. We went to the bedroom. It was neat, almost clinical in its organization. Sarah showed us where the pacing happened above us. Directly overhead, she pointed. Father Dominic nodded and opened his prayer book. He began with Latin. Standard stuff, I thought. Benedictus qui venit. His voice was steady, measured. He sprinkled holy water in the corners of the room. He held up his crucifix. And then something changed. Sarah's breathing got faster. Not possessed-style hyperventilation. Just faster. More anxious. Father Dominic noticed too because he started reading louder, moving through the prayers quicker. His hand was shaking slightly when he turned pages. That's when I heard the knocking. 3 knocks. Deliberate. On the wall directly behind me. My first instinct was adrenaline. Pure nervous system response. I stepped away from the wall. Father Dominic didn't pause. He kept reading, but I saw his jaw clench. The knocking came again. 3 times. On a different wall now. Sarah made a sound. Not quite a word. Not quite a cry. Something in her throat. Father Dominic told her to leave the room, to go to the kitchen, to pray if she could. She left. He kept reading. I should have left too. Should have gone to the kitchen. Instead, I stayed. I don't know why. Morbid curiosity, maybe. Or something else. Some part of me needed to see what would happen next. The knocking got faster. Still 3 beats, but coming in rapid succession now. One wall, then another. Then the ceiling. Father Dominic was reading so fast I could barely follow the words. His voice cracked twice. I'd never seen him rattled before. And then the footsteps started. Not in the attic. In the room with us. Right next to the dresser. I heard the floorboards creak under what sounded like weight, moving toward the bed. Slow and deliberate. Father Dominic stood up. He held the crucifix out in front of him like a shield and said something in Latin that wasn't in his prayer book. He was improvising. His voice had lost its calmness. It had an edge now, a kind of desperation. The footsteps kept moving. They passed right in front of me, and I felt the temperature drop, not metaphorically. It was like stepping from a warm room into a freezer. My breath suddenly visible, my hands going numb. That's when Father Dominic made a mistake. He changed his approach. Instead of continuing the prayers, he demanded that whatever was there leave. He commanded it. His voice got louder, more aggressive. "I bind you," he said. "I cast you out." The knocking stopped immediately. The footsteps stopped. The temperature normalized in about 10 seconds. And then we heard Sarah scream from the kitchen. We ran downstairs. She was standing in the middle of the room, pointing at the window above the sink, the one that looked out onto the backyard. In the darkness, there was a shape, a silhouette of someone standing maybe 30 feet from the house. Just standing there, facing the window, facing us. Father Dominic grabbed Sarah and told her to go to the bathroom, lock the door, and not come out until he said so. He didn't sound calm anymore. He sounded scared. He went to the window and closed every blind in the house. Didn't look outside again. Then he sat at the kitchen table and opened his prayer book back up. But he wasn't reading anymore. He was just sitting there, breathing heavily, staring at the closed blinds. "We need to leave," I said. He nodded but didn't move. After a few minutes, maybe 5, Sarah came out of the bathroom. She asked if it was gone. Father Dominic didn't answer. He just stood up, packed his bag, and walked to the door. As we were leaving, I noticed something I'd missed when we arrived. The daughter's bedroom door upstairs was open, and I could see her sitting on her bed, perfectly still, looking directly at the hallway, at us. But she never made a sound the entire time we were there. Father Dominic never went back to that house. When I asked him about it later, he said the case had been referred to the diocese and was now out of his hands. He wouldn't say anything else about it. He wouldn't even drive past the street. I left St. Michael's about a month later. Not because of what happened. Just timing. But sometimes I think about that daughter. About how she never came downstairs. How she was already upstairs, in her room, perfectly still. And I wonder if Father Dominic realized what he'd actually done that night. I think about that silhouette in the backyard. And I wonder if he'd made things worse instead of better. I never found out what happened to Sarah's family. I looked them up once, years later. The house was sold in 2010. The listing showed a basement I'd never seen. Concrete floor. No windows. I've never been back. Mixed with words I didn't recognize. My uncle remained completely calm. He kept praying. I put in the second cassette. This one was dated March 1987, also St. Catherine's. Same setup. Prayers, a person responding. My uncle's patient voice asking questions. But this time, I could hear something else in the background. A sound like furniture scraping, or maybe something heavier being dragged. Every time my uncle asked a question, there was a pause of maybe 3 seconds before the person responded. Not like they were thinking. Like there was a delay. Like someone was listening and then relaying information. By the 4th cassette, May 1987, I started noticing a pattern. The prayers were the same. The structure was identical, but the number of voices changed. On that one, I could hear at least 3 distinct voices overlapping during the Latin portions, all speaking at slightly different speeds, creating this nauseating effect where the words seemed to pile on top of each other. I took a break. This was clearly documentation of exorcisms, and while I understood the theological framework, my uncle was a priest after all. There was something deeply unsettling about listening to someone else's crisis, someone else's suffering, preserved on tape like a medical recording. But I kept going. The tapes from June through August of that year all came from St. Catherine's as well. Different dates, different voices, but the same methodical approach from my uncle. By June, I noticed he'd started asking different questions. Not just what is your name, but very specific inquiries. How long have you been present? What was your name before you took flesh? What are you afraid of? And the responses, they changed too. They became less defensive, less theatrical. The voices just answered, flatly, like they were being interviewed. I got through 9 of the 12 tapes in 2 days. I wasn't sleeping well. Not because they were frightening exactly. They were methodical and boring in many ways. But there was something accumulating, something I couldn't quite articulate. It was the consistency of it. The sheer routine. The 10th tape was dated December 1987, a 7-month jump. The label was different. Instead of St. Catherine's, it just said private. And the voice on it wasn't coming from a church. I could hear wind, or maybe an air conditioning unit, something constant and metallic in the background. When my uncle began speaking, his voice was different too. Not less calm, but cautious. Like he was choosing every word very carefully. This is the 10th session, he said. The subject has been resistant to traditional intervention. We're attempting a modified approach. The other voice, and I'm certain now it was a woman, though something about the timbre seemed wrong, began speaking without being prompted. She spoke in a measured way, almost like she was reading from a script. I understand the nature of your concern, she said, and I appreciate the efforts you've made. But you should know that this won't end the way you hope. My uncle didn't respond immediately. I could hear papers rustling, the sound of him writing something down. Why do you say that? He finally asked. Because I'm not what you think I am, the woman said. I'm not a demon. I'm not a separate entity. I was never separate, and removing me won't solve anything, Father. It will only create a problem you don't understand. The rest of that tape was quiet. My uncle asked her more questions, but she didn't answer. She just breathed, steady and even, for the remaining 10 minutes of the recording. I didn't sleep that night. The 11th tape was dated January 1988. My uncle's voice was tired now. Actually tired. I'd never heard that in his voice before. He sounded like he'd aged 10 years in 1 month. She hasn't spoken in 3 sessions, he said, speaking to himself or to whoever was recording. The family is requesting I stop. They're saying it's not helping. They're right. It's not helping. There was silence. Then the woman's voice, quiet and almost gentle. Let me go, Father. I can't, my uncle said. Then we'll both stay, the woman said. That's the way this works. You can't exorcise what was never separate. The 12th tape was the last one, dated March 1988. It was the longest. It went on for nearly 40 minutes, which was unusual. Most of the others ran between 15 and 25 minutes. On this one, my uncle wasn't speaking in a church or a private location. He was outside. I could hear actual traffic in the distance, birds, the ambient sound of a city morning. He was sitting by himself, and he was reading something aloud. Passages from scripture, but not in order. He'd read a few verses from Matthew, then jumped to Job, then to Psalms. His voice had a different quality now, not defeated, but accepting, like he was reciting something he'd committed to memory years ago. I kept looking for something to cast out, he said, his voice cracking slightly. But the lesson here is that sometimes the weight we carry isn't an invader. Sometimes it's a part of us we haven't learned to live with yet. And no amount of prayer changes that. Prayer just teaches us how to carry it differently. He sat in silence for a long time. The recording kept going, just the sound of the city, the cars, the birds. Then, very quietly, he said something I wasn't expecting. "I hope she's okay. I hope she's at peace now." The tape ended. I've listened to all 12 cassettes 3 times since that week. I've done some research. There's no record of my uncle performing exorcisms. St. Catherine's doesn't have documentation of him doing anything like that. The diocese has no files. He never reported these sessions to anyone in the church hierarchy. I asked my dad about it once casually. He said Uncle Michael had always been private, that he kept his pastoral work close to his chest. But he also said something else. He said that in the last decade of my uncle's life, he seemed different. More patient, less certain about things. Like he'd learned something that had changed his worldview. I still have those tapes. I don't listen to them anymore. But sometimes I think about what my uncle said on that last recording, sitting outside in the morning light, about weight we carry, about learning to live with things instead of trying to cast them out. I think he was trying to tell someone, maybe himself, maybe me, that some problems don't have solutions. They just have acceptance. And I'm still not sure which terrifies me more.